Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a pretty major ruling that just came down from the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB uh, basically just said that companies can no longer force their employees to attend those meetings that argue against unions, the ones. So to help break this all down, we got two articles here, one from the New York Times and one from Fortune magazine. Both came out just yesterday, November 13th. It's interesting timing, actually. Ever since the pandemic, there's been this surge in unionization efforts. Workers are really starting to band together and demand better conditions and pay. And of course, companies are kind of pushing back, which makes this ruling, well, it's kind of a bombshell. For like 76 years? Yeah, 76 years. Companies have been relying on this legal precedent called the Babcock and Wilcox-Coe rule from way back in 1948. And this ruling basically gave them the okay to hold these mandatory meetings. They could basically say whatever they wanted about unions, usually painting them in a bad light. But now the NLRB has decided to put a stop to that.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I think it shows how the power dynamic between employers and employees is maybe starting to shift. I mean, NLRB is essentially saying that workers have a right to hear both sides of the story, without feeling pressured by their bosses. This could really encourage more workers to consider joining a union without being afraid of what their company might do.
Right, exactly. And speaking of companies pushing back, this whole ruling was actually sparked by a case involving Amazon. Remember back in 2022 when there was that historic union election at the Staten Island warehouse, the one that Amazon ended up losing? Well, the New York Times article mentioned that Amazon held like hundreds of these captive audience meetings before that vote. They were basically trying to convince everyone to vote against the union.
Oh, yeah, that case was all over the news. It really became a focal point for the whole debate about worker rights. And I think it definitely got the attention of the NLRB. I mean, overturning something like the Babcock and Wilcox precedent, that sends a pretty clear message. These mandatory anti-union meetings are done.
So does that mean that companies can't talk to their employees about unions at all now?
Well, no, not exactly. The NLRB has this thing called a safe harbor provision, and that's where things get interesting.
Safe harbor. Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for us. What is this safe harbor provision all about?
Well, imagine you're an employee and your boss says there's going to be a meeting about unionization. Under this new rule, they have to make it totally clear that it's optional. You can skip it, and there won't be any consequences.
So no more required attendance, no penalties for skipping, and they can't even track who showed up.
Exactly. Companies still have a voice, but they can't force anyone to listen.
So is this actually a fair compromise, or is it just going to become like a loophole for companies to exploit?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, the NLRB is obviously trying to find some middle ground, protect workers' right to choose, but also respect employers' free speech rights. But the Fortune article points out some potential issues, like what's to stop a company from scheduling these meetings at really inconvenient times to discourage people from attending, or maybe making it clear that they'll look more favorably on employees who do show up. We'll just have to see how it all plays out.
It does seem like a bit of a balancing act, but it sounds like the NLRB is pretty serious about this. In the Times article, they quote the NLRB chair saying that these mandatory meetings gave employers near unfettered freedom to force their message about unionization on workers.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful statement. I think it really shows that they're starting to acknowledge that power imbalance between employers and employees.
Makes sense. But of course, not everyone is on board with this decision. The Fortune article mentions that Marvin Kaplan, a Republican member of the NLRB, actually filed a dissenting opinion.
Oh, interesting.
What was his take on the ruling?
Well, his argument is basically that by banning these captive audience meetings, the NLRB is violating employers' First Amendment rights, their freedom of speech. He says companies should be able to share their views on unionization with their employees, and that banning these meetings could set a dangerous precedent.
So we've got workers' right to freedom of association going up against employers' right to free speech. That's a tough one. How do you even begin to decide where the line is?
Yeah, it's a tricky legal issue for sure, and one that'll probably be debated for a long time. The NLRB's point, though, is that when you have an employer talking to their employees, there's already this inherent power dynamic. So those mandatory meetings can feel really coercive no matter what the message actually is.
I can see that. But let's look at it from the other side, too. Don't employers have a right to share their perspective on unions with their employees? They might argue that they're just trying to give people the facts so they can make an informed decision.
That's true. They could say that, and it is a valid point. They could argue that it's their responsibility to educate their workers about what unionization could mean, like how it might affect wages or benefits or even just the flexibility of the workplace. The question is, can they really present that information in a way that's neutral? And that's where a lot of the skepticism comes in.
Right, right. And of course, we can't forget about the political side of all this either. With the new Trump administration coming in, there's a chance this ruling could be challenged or even overturned.
Oh, definitely.
Especially if the NLRB ends up with different members who have different priorities. The Fortune article actually quotes an Amazon spokesperson, Mary Kate Paradis. She defends those captive audience meetings. She says that employees deserve to understand the facts so they can make an informed choice about unions.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with all of that.
Yeah. So even though this ruling seems like a big win for unions, it might not be the end of the story.
Exactly. This whole fight over worker rights is far from over, and the political landscape could change things pretty quickly.
For sure. Well, I think this is a good place to take a break. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much more to unpack. So make sure to come back for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the potential consequences of this ruling. See you then.
All right, so we've talked about this NLRB ruling and how it shakes things up, but let's zoom out a little. What does all this tell us about how things are going between workers and employers in the U.S. right now?
It does feel like something's changing, right?
Yeah.
Like we're at a turning point or something. We've got this huge increase in people wanting to join unions, especially younger workers. They're the ones really pushing for things like better wages and benefits and just having more of a say in what happens at their jobs. But then you've got companies pushing back. They're worried about costs, competition, all that stuff. What do you think? Where is all this tension heading?
I think we're definitely seeing a shift in power. Workers are realizing they have a lot more leverage than they may be used to.
Especially now with the job market being so tight.
Exactly. And they're seeing unions as a way to even things out a bit.
To get companies to actually listen to them.
Right. It's not just about blue-collar workers anymore either.
It's interesting you say that. Because we are seeing a lot more white-collar workers joining unions too. Even people in tech, even grad students.
It's like the whole idea of who belongs in a union is changing.
Exactly.
And I think part of that is because people are feeling more and more economically insecure.
Like no matter what your job is, it feels like it's getting harder to get ahead.
Well, people at the top just keep getting richer.
Yeah, that's definitely a feeling a lot of people have.
And that's where unions come in. They're seen as a way to fight for a fairer share.
A way to make sure everyone benefits, not just the people at the top.
Exactly.
But, unions have actually been losing members for a long time now. Do you think this new ruling could change that? Could this be the start of a whole new era for unions?
It's possible, sure, but it's not a guarantee. It really depends on whether unions can use this momentum to their advantage.
And adapt to the way work is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. They need to show that they can benefit a wider range of workers.
Not just the traditional union jobs.
Right. And they need to show that they're not against things like flexibility and innovation, because those are things that workers care about too.
So it's like they need to find a balance.
Yeah.
Between being disruptive and being practical.
Exactly. They need to be tough when they're negotiating with companies.
But also willing to work together to find solutions that work for everyone.
It's a tricky balance to strike.
This ruling is really focused on those mandatory anti-union meetings. But we all know companies have other ways to discourage people from joining unions.
Yeah, they've got a whole playbook.
So do you think this ruling will really level the playing field? Or will companies just find new ways to get their message across?
That's a really good question. Companies are definitely going to adapt. We might see even more of those anti-union campaigns. But maybe they'll be a little more subtle. They might start using more consultants, too, people who specialize in keeping unions out.
So it's like a game of whack-a-mole?
Pretty much.
You get rid of one tactic, another one pops up.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important for workers to be aware of what's going on. They need to know their rights.
And be able to see through the spin.
Exactly.
So this ruling might be a step in the right direction. But it's just one small part of a much bigger issue.
I think that's right. It's not just about one legal ruling. We have to look at all the things that contribute to that power imbalance between workers and employers.
Like income inequality.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
And the fact that things like social safety nets are disappearing.
Right.
And the fact that workers just have fewer protections than they used to.
It's a whole system that needs to change.
So it's not just about laws. It's about a whole shift in how we think about work and labor.
Exactly.
So if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but what does it mean for me? What's the big takeaway here?
I think the main thing is that this ruling has really brought the issue of worker rights to the forefront.
It's made people start paying attention.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that the balance of power can change.
It's not set in stone.
And it's being challenged right now.
So what you're saying is that this is a call to action.
I think so. It's a call to be informed, to get involved, to understand your rights.
And to think about what you can do to make things more fair for everyone.
Whether you're an employee, an employer, or just someone who cares about this issue.
Yeah, I like that. So let's talk more about that in part 3, about what people can actually do to make a difference. All right, so we're back. And for this last part of our deep dive, let's try to look ahead a bit. We've talked about the legal stuff, the political angles, and how all this affects workers and employers. So now, what about the future? What might actually happen because of this ruling?
Okay, yeah, let's put on our futurist hats.
I love it.
So one possibility, let's say the ruling stands, it survives any legal challenges, and it really starts to have an impact.
Totally.
Workers see this as a win, they feel more confident about organizing, and we see this surge in unionization all across the country. Companies have to adapt. Maybe they're not thrilled about it at first, but they do it.
Makes sense.
And what we end up with is this more balanced, more equitable situation for everyone. Wages go up, benefits get better, workers have a real voice.
Sounds pretty utopian, right?
It does, doesn't it?
But things don't always work out so perfectly.
Definitely not.
Even if this ruling stays in place, couldn't companies just try to find ways around it? What other tactics could they use to keep things in their favor?
Oh, for sure. Companies are really good at adapting. They'll figure something out.
Like what?
Well, we could see even more of those anti-union campaigns.
Right, the messaging
I
ones,
think exactly. But maybe they'll be more subtle this time.
less in your face.
Right.
Yeah.
And they might start relying even more on those consultants.
The ones who specialize in preventing unions.
Exactly.
So it's like this constant back and forth.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that's one possibility. But what if things go the other way? What if the ruling gets overturned?
Okay, so scenario 2.
Yeah.
A higher court could step in, or maybe the NLRB ends up with different members under a new administration.
We did talk about how that's a possibility.
Right, and if that happens, and this ruling is reversed, that's a huge blow to unions, and it could mean that companies just go back to doing things the way they did before.
Back to square one.
Pretty much. It just goes to show that even when you get a legal win, it's not always permanent. This fight for worker rights, it's constant. You can't let up.
So we've got the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. What about something in between?
Okay, so scenario 3.
Hit me with it.
We get this mixed bag of outcomes. Different industries, different parts of the country, all reacting in different ways.
Okay, I can see that.
Some companies, maybe they're already more progressive, or maybe they're facing a lot of pressure from their workers.
They go along with the new rules?
Exactly. Maybe they even use it as an opportunity to build a better relationship with their employees.
But then other companies, they fight it every step of the way.
They resist, they look for loopholes, they do whatever they can to keep things the way they are.
And then you've got everyone in between.
Right. Some companies might try a little of both, see what they can get away with.
Testing the waters.
Exactly.
So it's not going to be this clear-cut victory for either side.
I don't think so. It's more like things are going to get shaken up.
And we'll see what settles out.
It'll be interesting to watch it all unfold.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So this ruling, it's a big deal. But it's really just the beginning.
I think that's right.
It's like it's kicked off this whole new phase in the conversation about worker rights.
Yeah, and it shows that things can change. It's not hopeless.
And that when people come together, they can really make a difference.
Exactly.
Okay, so for everyone listening out there, what can they actually do to support worker rights? How can they get involved?
Well, first things first, stay informed.
Keep up with the news.
Read articles like the ones we've been talking about today. Learn about the issues.
Knowledge is power.
Right. Absolutely. And connect with other people who care about this stuff.
Find your people.
Right. Join a group, go to a rally, even just talk to your coworkers about what's happening.
Sort those conversations.
Exactly, because that's how you build solidarity.
And that's how you make change happen.
And you can also support organizations that are already fighting for worker rights.
Donate, volunteer, spread the word.
All of that helps.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, though, right? Like, what can one person really do?
Even small things can make a difference.
Like what?
Talk to your boss about things you're concerned about.
Okay.
If there's a chance to join a union, do it. And if you see something unfair happening at work, don't be afraid to speak up.
Don't just stay silent.
Right, we need to hold each other accountable.
And remember, change takes time.
It's not going to happen overnight.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with this one legal ruling and ended up talking about the whole future of work.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It really is.
And it shows that we all have a role to play in building a fairer, more just society.
So, to everyone listening, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for what you believe in.
The future of work is being written right now.
And your voice matters.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.